When Clint Eastwood casually walked past a busy art stand on a bustling city sidewalk, most people didn't even glance in his direction. To them, he was just another passerby, another anonymous figure blending into the sea of people moving through the streets. But when he suddenly stopped, picked up a painting, and quietly listened to the young woman standing in front of the display, the energy in the air shifted, because this wasn't just any artist. Sophie Carter wasn't merely seeking recognition or hoping to make a sale. She was painting to save her own life. And what happened next would turn into a moment that no one would ever forget. Because, in true Clint Eastwood fashion, he didn't just buy a painting, he changed her life forever. It had all started in a dim, sterile hospital room, where the fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting a dull, pale glow over the pristine white walls. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, mingling with the steady, rhythmic beeping of monitors from the room next door. Sophie Carter sat on the crinkled paper of the hospital bed, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap, her pulse quickening. Across from her, Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses with slow, deliberate care, his face a carefully composed mask of neutrality. But Sophie already knew what was coming. She had heard that tone before, gentle, rehearsed, the one doctors used when they were about to say something difficult. "The treatment is working," he finally said, a hint of cautious optimism threading through his voice. "But you'll need at least 2 more rounds of chemotherapy." Sophie barely reacted. She had been through this before. The pain, the nausea, the relentless exhaustion, it had become part of her reality. What she wasn't prepared for was what he said next. "I understand your family is struggling with the costs," he continued, hesitating just a moment before exhaling softly. "Unfortunately, without insurance coverage for the next round, the out-of-pocket expenses will be substantial." A heavy silence settled over the room. Sophie's mother let out a shaky breath beside her, and even without looking, Sophie knew she was fighting back tears. The medical bills had already drained them completely. Their savings were gone. The previous treatments had pushed them to the very edge, and now this? For the first time in a long time, a new kind of fear gripped Sophie's chest. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of watching her parents lose everything just to keep her alive. The drive home was silent. Her mother's hands were wrapped so tightly around the steering wheel that her knuckles had turned white. Her father's voice had been rough when he told her that everything would be okay, but Sophie could hear the lie in it. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her heart pounded. She refused to be a burden. She refused to let her parents drown in debt because of her. And that's when it hit her. Art. It had always been her refuge, her escape, her passion. If she could create something meaningful, something people would want to buy, maybe, just maybe, she could fight back in her own way. By morning, her mind was made up. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle, she was going to create one. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic. The brush moved across the canvas, leaving behind soft hues of blue, bold streaks of orange, the colors swirling together to form something new, something alive. Seated on a foldable stool, Sophie set up her art stand on a lively downtown sidewalk, her small wooden table covered in neatly arranged canvases, each one a fragment of her soul. Her mother had helped her set up that morning, but the rest was up to Sophie. It had been her idea after all. She had spent the last week pouring every ounce of energy she had left into her paintings, knowing that this wasn't just about art anymore. It was about survival. If she could sell enough, if people could see value in her work, then maybe, just maybe, she could afford the treatment that could save her life. But hope was a fragile thing. Pedestrians passed by, some casting quick glances her way, others not even noticing her presence. A woman in a navy blazer slowed for a moment, admiring a piece before shaking her head and walking on. A man in sunglasses and a tailored suit stopped long enough to read the small handwritten sign in front of her booth. "Originally art funding my cancer treatment." His lips pressed into a thin line before he, too, turned and walked away. Sophie exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. The afternoon heat pressed down on her, making her lightheaded. It had been hours, and she hadn't sold a single piece. She reached for her water bottle, her fingers trembling as she took a sip. Fatigue gnawed at her, a cruel reminder that she wasn't just fighting the indifference of the world, she was battling her own body. But giving up wasn't an option. She forced a smile as an elderly couple approached, the woman's eyes lighting up with curiosity. "These are beautiful," she murmured, running her fingers lightly over the edge of a canvas. It was one of Sophie's favorites, a vast desert sky, painted in deep purples and streaks of gold. "How much for this one?" Sophie swallowed hard. $80. The woman exchanged a glance with her husband, who nodded. "We'll take it." For a moment, Sophie didn't move. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over, but now that it was happening, she felt frozen. Then, as the woman placed the cash into her hands, something inside Sophie cracked open. Her first sale, her first victory. She held on to that feeling as she carefully packed the painting into a paper bag. The couple walked away, leaving Sophie with $80 and a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe she was just one girl selling art on a street corner, but she was fighting, and she wasn't done yet. Around her, the city pulsed with life. Street musicians strummed guitars on the corners, their melodies blending with the distant hum of traffic. Tourists wandered past, snapping pictures of murals painted on the weathered brick walls of old buildings. The world kept moving, unaware of the battles Sophie was fighting. But she knew, and she wasn't about to stop now. Businessmen, their eyes glued to their phones, brushed past her without a second glance. Sophie sat at her small wooden table, hands resting on her knees, watching the world move around her. It was a strange feeling, to be surrounded by so many people, yet feel completely invisible. She had sold one painting so far, just one. Every time someone glanced in her direction, a spark of hope flared in her chest. Maybe this time, maybe this person would stop. Maybe they would admire her work not out of pity, but because they saw her as an artist, someone who had something worth offering. Most didn't. Some slowed their pace, their eyes flicking over her canvases, curiosity piqued for a fleeting moment, only to keep walking. Others barely noticed her at all, lost in their own worlds, their own problems. And then there were the ones who did stop, but not to buy, only to offer their pity. The middle-aged woman in a floral dress paused, reading the handwritten sign in front of Sophie's stand. Her lips pursed, her eyes softening as they landed on the words, "Original art, funding my cancer treatment." "Oh, honey," the woman murmured, voice thick with sympathy, "I wish I could help, but I just don't have the money." Sophie forced a polite smile. "That's okay. Thank you for stopping." The woman lingered, studying her as if searching for the right words. "You poor thing. You must be so brave." Brave. That word again. Sophie had heard it too many times since her diagnosis, but it never felt right. She wasn't brave. She was desperate. She was tired. Still she nodded, let the woman say her piece, and then watched her walk away, just like the others. Not long after, a different kind of customer showed up. A man in a leather jacket, sunglasses perched atop his head, sauntered up to her stand, arms crossed as he scanned the paintings with mild amusement. He let out a low chuckle and shook his head. "Nobody buys real art anymore, kid," he muttered. "You should try selling prints or, I don't know, get on TikTok. Do commissions or something." Sophie's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. A sharp response burned at the back of her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had dealt with people like this before. People who didn't understand, who saw art as nothing more than a hobby, who thought dreams weren't worth chasing. "I don't need your advice," she said, her voice steady. "I just need to fight." The man snorted but didn't argue. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Sophie let out a slow breath, releasing the tension from her shoulders. She refused to let frustration win, because somewhere in this city, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, someone would see her, and that would change everything. By the fourth day, exhaustion settled deep into her bones. Her body ached from hours of sitting on the hard metal stool. The lingering effects of chemotherapy had left her muscles weak. The relentless summer heat pressed against her skin, making her dizzy. She had sold 3 paintings in total. It wasn't enough, not even close. She tried to stay optimistic, but doubt was creeping in. Maybe the man in the leather jacket had been right. Maybe no one cared. And then, out of nowhere, someone stopped. Not just any customer. The journalist. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, carrying a notebook in one hand and a press badge clipped to her bag. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her eyes lit up as she took in the display. "This is beautiful," she said, pointing to a twilight cityscape, painted in deep purples and golds. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" Sophie blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah." The journalist smiled, pulling out her phone. "I run a small online arts blog. I love finding hidden talent in the city. Mind if I take a few photos?" Sophie hesitated. "Wait, really?" "Really?" For the next few minutes, the woman took pictures of the paintings, of Sophie at her stand, of the handwritten sign explaining why she was there. Then, she asked a question Sophie wasn't expecting. "What's your story?" So Sophie told her. About the hospital visits, the medical bills stacking higher and higher, about how she refused to let her parents bear the burden alone. The journalist nodded, jotting notes in her notebook. "People should hear this," she said. "I'll make sure they do." Sophie didn't think much of it. People made promises all the time. But the next morning, when she arrived at her stand, something had changed. More people were stopping, not just to look, but to buy. A woman bought 2 paintings without hesitation. A young couple stood at her table, flipping through her canvases, debating which one to take home. By noon, Sophie had sold more paintings than she had in the past 4 days combined. Then her phone buzzed. A message from Lucas, her best friend. "Dude, check this out." She clicked the link. It was an article, her article, "Fighting for Art, Fighting for Life, the teen who's painting her way to chemo." And at the bottom, thousands of shares. Sophie's heart pounded. This was real. People were listening. People were seeing her. But even then, she didn't realize just how big this moment was about to become. Because her biggest customer yet? He was already on his way. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. Another wave of pedestrians rushed past, lost in their own distractions. The city was a blur of motion, a symphony of noise, car horns, distant music, hurried conversations. Sophie wiped the sweat from her forehead, trying to ignore the dizziness creeping in. Her body was screaming at her to rest, but rest wouldn't pay for chemo. She exhaled, adjusting the stack of paintings on her table. The article had made a difference. Sales were picking up, but she was still far from her goal. And then, without warning, the energy around her shifted. A stillness, quiet yet powerful. She felt it before she saw him. The tall, older man had stopped at her stand. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't distracted, wasn't scrolling through his phone, wasn't in a hurry to get somewhere else. He stood completely still, hands tucked into the pockets of a weathered leather jacket, a cowboy hat tilted low over his face. He was studying her paintings. Not just looking, really seeing. At first, Sophie barely paid him any mind. She had seen all kinds of customers. Curious tourists. Skeptical businessmen hurried past, barely sparing her a glance. Distracted shoppers slowed just long enough to feign interest before walking away, their attention drifting elsewhere. Sophie had seen it all before. But this guy, something about him was different. She was too exhausted to put her finger on why. "See anything you like?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of calling out to potential customers. The man smirked. "Just a little. Just enough for her to notice." "Depends," he said, his voice low, gravelly, and unmistakably familiar. "What's the story behind these?" Sophie hesitated. Most people asked about prices, not the story. She took a proper look at him this time. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes held something sharp, something steady. They looked like they had seen 100 lifetimes and weren't easily impressed. There was something about him that felt like an old Western come to life. She cleared her throat. "I paint because I have to," she said simply. "It's the only thing I can control right now." He didn't blink. He didn't fill the silence with empty words or sympathy. He just waited. And somehow that made her want to tell him more. So she did. She told him about the diagnosis, about the ticking clock the doctors had given her, about how every brushstroke, every sail wasn't just about survival, it was about taking back her life. And when she finished, the man didn't offer empty reassurances or condolences. He just nodded. Then, without a word, he reached for a painting. The man lifted a black and white canvas from the table, tilting it slightly in the afternoon light. It was one of Sophie's favorites, a vast desert landscape, the silhouette of a lone cowboy standing in the distance. The contrast between the deep shadows and the vast, endless sky above had taken her weeks to perfect. He studied it carefully, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. "I'll take this one." Sophie barely reacted at first. She had done this a dozen times before, watched customers pick a piece, hand over cash, walk away without a second thought. She swallowed and ran a hand through the back of her short-cropped hair. Okay. It's $200. The man didn't even reach for his wallet. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook. Sophie blinked, momentarily thrown off. No one carried checkbooks anymore. She watched as he uncapped a pen, his movements slow, deliberate. He scribbled something down, tore the check from the book and handed it to her. She took it hesitantly, barely gripping the paper between her fingers. And then she saw the number. Her breath caught, her vision blurred at the edges, as her eyes locked onto the check, onto the impossible amount written in bold, neat handwriting. Not $200. $50,000. Her hands started to shake. "This," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "This can't be right." The man smirked, tilting his hat back slightly, finally revealing his face fully. And Sophie's world stopped. Clint Eastwood, the legend, the icon, the man whose films her dad had made her watch growing up, the man whose stare alone had defined generations of cinema. And now, he was standing right in front of her, buying her art. No changing her life. She couldn't breathe. She started, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't take this." Clint's blue eyes didn't waver. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a damn good painting." Sophie felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared. People were staring now. The few pedestrians nearby had taken notice, their whispers growing louder. Someone pulled out a phone, snapping a picture. But Sophie didn't care about the crowd. She looked at Clint, really looked at him, and saw something deeper in his expression. A quiet understanding. He knew what it meant to fight for something. He had spent his life doing it. And now, in the middle of a busy street, he had just given her the chance to keep fighting too. Her hands clenched around the check. For the first time in months, Sophie felt something she had almost forgotten. And the craziest part? This was only the beginning. Sophie's world tilted. She stared at the check in her trembling hands, her mind struggling to catch up with what she was seeing. Not $200, not $2,000, $50,000. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the paper, as if it might vanish if she didn't hold on tight enough. The noise of the city faded, the rush of pedestrians, the distant honking of cars, the hum of street musicians. It all blurred into a dull, meaningless hum. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She forced herself to blink, to look again, convinced that she had read the number wrong. But there it was, clear as day. $50,000. Her stomach flipped, her pulse thundered in her ears. "This," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of it. "This must be a mistake." She looked up at the man, the cowboy in the leather jacket, the one who had spent the last few minutes casually flipping through her paintings like he had all the time in the world. And now, standing under the glare of the afternoon sun, she saw him for the first time. The sharp blue eyes, the familiar smirk, the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime unshaken by the world around him. Her breath caught. Clint Eastwood. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her father's favorite actor. The man whose movies had played in her living room every weekend growing up. The Hollywood icon who didn't just play tough guys on screen, he was one in real life. And now he was standing in front of her, handing her a check that could change everything. Clint watched her carefully, reading the shock on her face. Then he smirked. "No mistake, kid," he said, his voice low, steady. "You just keep painting." Sophie swallowed hard. Her legs felt like they might give out. She opened her mouth, trying to form words. "Thank you, why are you doing this? I don't deserve this." But nothing came out. Because nothing in her life had ever prepared her for this moment. And it wasn't over yet. At first, no one noticed. The city moved as it always did, fast, distracted, unaware that history was unfolding on the sidewalk. Then came the first whisper. A teenage boy, earbuds in, stopped mid-step, his head tilting as he stared at Clint. His eyes widened. "Wait," he muttered, his voice uncertain but growing louder. "Is that Clint Eastwood?" A woman nearby squinted, phone half raised, her gaze flicking between Sophie's stand and the man in the worn-out cowboy hat. Then a second whisper. A third. And then it happened. A ripple turned into a wave. People froze in their tracks, heads whipped around, conversations halted. Someone gasped, another snapped a photo. And just like that, the quiet afternoon erupted into chaos. The whispers became shouts. "Oh my God, it's really him. Clint Eastwood is here, right here on this sidewalk. Wait, is he buying a painting? What's going on?" Phones shot up in every direction. A group of college students rushed closer, voices thick with disbelief. A businesswoman nearly tripped as she backtracked, dragging her assistant along. Then came the tipping point. A man in a suit who had walked past Sophie's stand earlier without a glance turned back. "What's happening?" he asked, stepping closer. He looked at Clint, then at Sophie, then at the check in her trembling hands. And when he saw the number, his jaw dropped. "Wait, he just bought a painting," a woman gasped. "For $50,000. That was it?" The crowd exploded. People surged toward Sophie's stand. Their eyes darted between her and Clint, trying to process what they were witnessing. And then the wildest thing happened. Someone reached for a painting. "I'll take this one," a man in a blue polo called out, pulling out his wallet. Before Sophie could even process the sale, another hand shot forward. "And this one, how much is it?" a woman asked, flipping through the remaining canvases. Within minutes, the paintings that had been ignored for days were gone. People didn't haggle, they didn't hesitate, they just bought. A teenage girl turned to her mom, eyes wide. "I need cash, now! I want one before they're gone!" Sophie sat there, stunned, as her once quiet stand transformed into the hottest attraction in the city. And Clint? Clint just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching it all unfold. Finally, he leaned in slightly, muttering just loud enough for Sophie to hear. "Told you, kid, just keep painting." And with that, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Sophie to witness something she never could have imagined. And the craziest part? This was just the beginning. By the time Sophie got home that night, her phone was on fire. Notifications flooded her screen. The constant ping, ping, ping of messages and alerts made her head spin. At first, she thought something was wrong. Then she saw the headlines. Clint Eastwood buys teen's painting for $50,000, and you won't believe why. Hollywood legend helps young artist battling cancer in the most unbelievable way. Teen's art stand becomes the talk of the nation after a surprise visit from Clint Eastwood. Her photo was everywhere. A single image, Clint Eastwood standing at her tiny art booth, holding the black and white Western painting, was plastered across news sites, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And the video? Someone had caught the exact moment he handed her the check. Over 3 million views. Sophie couldn't breathe. Her best friend Lucas was the first to call. "Sophie, you are literally everywhere." "Aye," she whispered, scrolling through the endless comments. She could barely keep up. Then the messages started. Not just from strangers, from buyers. "Hi Sophie, I'd love to buy a piece of your work. Do you ship to Texas? Your story inspired me so much. I'd like to commission a painting, any price, just name it. My daughter is also fighting cancer. Your strength gives us hope. I'd love to buy something to support you." Her hands shook. Dozens of messages turned into hundreds. Then thousands. Orders, donations, requests for interviews. And then the email that stopped her cold. Subject, Gallery Inquiry. She clicked on it with trembling fingers. A prestigious New York gallery owner wanted to represent her. Sophie, your story is remarkable. We'd love to showcase your work in our upcoming exhibition. Let's talk. Her hand pressed against her chest, her heartbeat hammering. This was real. She wasn't just selling paintings anymore. She had become a symbol of resilience. 1 month later, Sophie walked into the hospital for her final round of treatment. Paid in full. Every bill, every debt, every crushing financial burden that had once threatened her future, gone, all because of one painting. One moment. Because a man in a cowboy hat had stopped, listened, and believed in her. The chemo was rough, but this time she wasn't scared. Because outside that hospital room, a future was waiting for her. A week after her last treatment, she received a letter, handwritten, from Clint Eastwood. She opened it carefully, her fingers shaking. Sophie, your fight reminds me why some stories still matter. Never stop telling yours. Clint. Tears welled in her eyes. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. And later that night, she picked up a brush and started to paint. Her first official gallery show was set for the next month. Her inbox was flooded with commission requests. Her career was just beginning. But there was one painting she would never sell. The first one she had ever sold. The black and white Western landscape. It now hung in Clint Eastwood's private collection. A reminder that true grit isn't just in Westerns.